Hello, my American history students. This is your second video of the week. The first video, we talked a little bit more about the Civil War. Today, we're going to talk about the Civil War, but towards the end of the Civil War, what happened, some of the battles, and some of the new developments that happened because of the Civil War. So, the Civil War was the bloodiest war in American history. There were several key battles that had a significant impact during the war. Antietam, Vicksburg, and Gettysburg. Those are the big three battles. All of these battles caused a shift in the war between the states. At the Battle of Antietam, Confederate troops were hoping to win a battle on Union soil. Just before this battle, the Confederacy beat back Union troops who were attempting to take the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. General Robert E. Lee decided that he could use that momentum to stage a battle on Union soil in Maryland and win. His plans for the battle were called Special Order 191, in which he split his troops to attack from different sides. The Union troops, with the leadership of General George McClellan, found a copy of the battle plans at an abandoned Confederate camp. The Union soldiers met the Confederate soldiers at Antietam Creek. 12 hours of fighting ended with 23,000 casualties and more than 3,500 dead. The Confederate Army retreated, and President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation to freed slaves in rebelling states. This battle was a turning point because the war was no longer just about bringing the Union together. It was about ending slavery for good. The battle at Vicksburg was a significant Union victory. Union soldiers under the leadership of General Ulysses S. Grant fought Confederate soldiers for control of the Mississippi River. Whoever controlled the river controlled transportation and supplies. So both sides fought to gain control of the river. The Union soldiers moved south of Vicksburg and captured Jackson, Mississippi, and they moved north. They trapped the Confederate Army with this maneuver. The Confederate soldiers managed to push the Union Army back temporarily. As it was, the Union soldiers captured the city of Vicksburg and waited more than 40 days for the Confederate Army to surrender once they ran out of supplies. The 6-week battle was important because it gave the Union Army control of the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy in half. So the Union Army could control the supplies being brought into the South, okay? The Battle of Gettysburg was the decisive battle for the Civil War as well. And we talked a little bit about this last week, okay? It's also the most well-known battle of the Civil War. General Lee once again decided to invade the North and try to win a battle on Union soil. 3 long days of fighting led to more than 51,000 casualties on both sides. This battle became the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. The Union Army nearly destroyed the Confederate Army, killing or wounding 1/3 of their soldiers. This battle turned the war in favor of the Union, and the Confederacy lost all hope of winning. So let's talk about caring for the wounded on the battlefield. 620,000. That is the approximate number of deaths during the Civil War. Men died from battle injuries, starvation, and illness. But who took care of these soldiers? As the number of casualties continued to grow, it was women who stepped up to do their part in the war effort. During the course of the war, the Union had close to 20,000 women working to comfort, heal, and care for the sick, wounded soldiers. Roughly 3,000 of these women were white, middle-class women employed as nurses. The rest of the women were from the working class and free and enslaved African Americans who worked as laundresses, cooks, and matrons. Together, the women, in conjunction with the United States Sanitary Commission, worked to improve conditions in camps and hospitals, so therefore decreasing the rate of deaths. One woman of note was Mary Edwards Walker, a surgeon during the war. Walker was a doctor in her own right, a women's rights activist, and often dressed in more manly attire for comfort and practicability. She entered the war as a volunteer nurse and eventually became an assistant surgeon. Walker was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, the first woman to do so, for her work in the battlefield. However, she was stripped of her title in 1917 when the award standards were redefined. In 1977, her Medal of Honor was reinstated after her death, again recognizing her for her wartime efforts. Harriet Tubman, the famous conductor of the Underground Railroad, led an armed group through South Carolina in the Civil War effort. Clara Barton, a nurse and founder of the American Red Cross, was another major contributor to the well-being of soldiers in the war. She said that Civil War put a woman at least 50 years in advance of the normal position which continued peace would have assigned her. So because of the war, women were allowed to have roles that normally men would have and they were not allowed to take on or have, okay? So the war kind of afforded women more freedom that they wouldn't normally have enjoyed if it wasn't wartime. All right. So now we're going to talk about the Civil War winding down, okay? After the Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil War began to wind down. Union victories in Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Chattanooga, and Appomattox helped bring the war to an end in 1865. The Civil War is the bloodiest war in the history of the United States, with 620,000 casualties. Both Union and Confederate forces had well-trained generals. The Confederacy had the advantage of fighting a mostly defensive war on familiar territory. Remember, most of the battles were fought in the South, so the Confederate Army had the advantage of knowing the land. The North's advantages were having more soldiers who were better trained, more resources, and advanced technology. Remember, in the North, they had the factories to produce mass amounts of ammunition and clothing. President Lincoln, along with most people, believed that the Civil War would be short. They had no idea it would last for years in an effort to bring peace and unity to the young country. It became evident as the war wore on that the only way to solve the problem of states' rights regarding slavery was to take that decision away from the states. Abraham Lincoln had made mention of this in some speeches. He had stated that the only way for our nation to deal with the issue of slavery would be either to allow it in all states or to ban it in all states. He had hoped that he could keep the Union together by allowing slavery in those states that wanted it and banning it in those states that chose not to have it. One problem was that some federal laws had already been made to make it legal to bring enslaved Africans into free states or territories. In addition, the fugitive slave law meant that people who escaped slavery had made it to free territory could be returned back to their owners. So remember we talked about all the different compromises that were put in effect to prevent the slavery issue coming to a head. So Lincoln originally tried to make it so that the states that wanted slavery could have slavery, and the states that wanted to be free could be free. But the compromises didn't work. Remember the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Compromise of 1850, just made it worse, okay? People kept arguing. So Lincoln came to the conclusion that it had to be a federal problem. Either all the states allowed slavery or none of the states allowed slavery. Throughout the war, escaped or enslaved African Americans fought on both sides. No matter which side they fought on, they were fighting for their freedom. As the Union troops traveled south, enslaved African Americans escaped to join the Union Army so they could fight for their freedom. Slavery was mostly outlawed in the North, and any enslaved African Americans who made it to the Union Army were emancipated or declared free. After the battle at Antietam, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862. The law took effect on January 1st, 1863. It was at this moment that the war no longer was about just preserving the Union. It became a war to end slavery in this country. The Emancipation Proclamation was used as leverage to bring about the end of the Civil War. The South was now fighting to keep slavery. European nations who were considering helping the Confederacy would no longer help since they were opposed to slavery. The proclamation also allowed for freed Africans to serve in the Union Army, which an estimated 200,000 free Africans chose to do. One example was the 54th Regiment of African American soldiers who fought at Fort Wagner, South Carolina. In 1885, after many defeats and the destruction of many towns, Confederate Robert E. Lee met with Union General Ulysses S. Grant to surrender. So now the last thing we're going to talk about today, at least, is General Lee surrendering. And then next week, we're going to get towards the end of the war and the effects the war had on the country. So they were trapped after a weary march from Petersburg with disheartened troops deserting along the way and General Robert E. Lee trying to muster up new soldiers to join the ranks. The Confederate Army was ready to quit. With no food, no supplies, and no support, Lee now realized that he had little or no choice. He wrote to General Ulysses S. Grant regarding terms and conditions of his surrender. The arrangements were made. The two generals met at 1 p.m. at the residence of Wilmer McLean at the Appomattox Courthouse. General Lee came dressed in his full military attire, while General Grant appeared as though he had just come from the battlefield. They sat together, exchanging pleasantries, as much as one could during wartime, before Lee brought up the topic of surrender. In order for the Confederacy to surrender, he asked that all the officers and men be granted a full pardon, be allowed to carry their private belongings such as a sidearm, and be permitted to return back to their hometown with their horses. The horses were important because when they got home, they would more than likely need to use the horses to resume plowing and the ground for farming. Remember, the South was mainly agricultural economy, so they needed horses to plow the fields. The starving troops were also to be fed as part of the agreement. Grant was agreeable, trying to pave the way for reconciliation between the North and the South. So Ulysses S. Grant was very good about granting the Confederate Army concessions. He let them leave with their horses, with their sidearms. He let them leave to go back to their hometown. All of this was in the hopes to keep the Union together and foster more friendship. If they said to General Lee that we're going to kill all your army, you're surrendering, we're taking all your guns, all your horses, that would be normal. That would be a normal happening for someone surrendering to another army. But because it was a civil war between countrymen, we wanted to treat them with respect and friendship because eventually they're going to come back into the fold as part of the Union. We didn't want to cause resentment from the Southerners. So even though a few skirmishes continued afterwards, Lee's surrender at Appomattox House was essentially the end of the Civil War. So next week, we're going to talk about the effects of the Civil War and rebuilding the South and how that went. So your assignment for this video is going to be called A Not So Civil War. You're going to be a reporter from 1865 and you're going to be writing a news article using the facts from this video to write an article about the Civil War. Okay, you can be from the North or the South, that's up to you. Again, you're going to scroll down to the description of the video, click on the link, it'll take you to the worksheet. Once you fill it out, you can type your answers, email them back to me, or you can write it down and show them to me in our Zoom meetings Monday at 9:30. If you do both of the video assignments for the week, you get entered to win a $25 gift card. So get on that. All right, guys, I will see you Monday.